John Council. We're back here at the Avalon Diving History Exhibit in Avalon, California on Catalina Island. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about the evolution of masks. Now, of course, as divers, we all recognize the importance of being able to see underwater. That's the most principal and primary kind of part of our equipment, that we need to be able to see what we're doing. And in the early days, when we started out, you can date back even hundreds of years, there were no full face masks or full lens masks. Everything was goggles. That was the simplest kind of design to utilize. And ancient cultures of pearl divers in Polynesia and South Asia utilized bamboo type goggles that they used, and they polished shells down to a very thin, opaque lens so that they couldn't really see clearly, but they could see shadows, light, and things like that. They used that to go down and collect oysters. And so I got a pair of the bamboo goggles we'll look at in a second. But in the early days, goggles were the thing, and that's what people utilized. And in 1938, a famous spearfisherman named Guy Gilpatrick sort of chronicled all his works in a piece that was kind of his tome called The Complete Goggler. And that's what, before there were skin divers or scuba divers or anything like that, they were called goggle fishermen. And of course, the equipment they used were goggles to see. Eventually, people wanted to get away from the goggles because of the pressure against the eye socket without having an ability to balance the gas inside. So when you built up the hydrostatic pressure, you had problems. And so some enterprising young spearfishermen began experimenting with making a full lens mask. And what they would use is either pieces of fire hose or heavy radiator hose, and they would trim with a pocket knife and kind of carve it to sort of fit the contour of the face, and then they would use a steam valve lens held in place with a hose clamp, and they would either make their head straps out of pieces of twine, line, or in the case of these, when I asked dive legend Cat Perkins, I said, well, what did you use for head straps? He looked at me like, come on, kid. He says, inner tube. And I thought, oh yeah, of course, inner tubes, why not? So this is one of the early designs, and it was actually picked up by a company called CNET Manufacturing, and they modeled their very first sea dive masks out of Southern California after that radiator hose and steam valve lens design, and they actually, in their prototypes, used the inner tube strapping, which is what this version has. This is one of the CNET sea dive masks. Eventually, they improved their design. The frame sort of stayed the same. They got away from the hose clamp, and then they used a strap designed specifically for the mask. But this was the original first commercially made mask in the United States, or anywhere actually, and this was the system. Pretty dynamic, and it allowed people to be able to exhale through their nose into the mask and balance the pressure out from hydrostatic weight. And it was an effective system. The skirt was not exactly perfect, but that's how things start out. Back in here's a fun mask. In the early 40s, Victor Berg was a Navy diver. He designed a system for shallow water diving. This is an incredible piece of equipment. You have to remember, you have to harken back to the 30s and 40s, when really the only practical way of getting underwater was with a large brass or copper helmet, and it has a fairly large volume and some size, and if you're trying to do works that are tight or up close to something, working around the rudder of a ship or something, a little tough to do. So this mask is much smaller volume. It looks very much like a gas mask, but it was a system that was much smaller, more compact, and allowed the user to be able to get into tight confines, and was very, very popular at the time. Of course, regulators hadn't been invented yet, and so this system could either be used with a storage bottle like a scuba tank, except that rather than having a regulator, you just had a series of valves that you could adjust that could adjust the flow, and that's how it worked. Or it could have a surface supply system as well. So this is a pretty cool system. I've actually used this mask before. It's it's reasonably comfortable, but it scares a lot of people, I think. So anyway, it's pretty neat. the Desco Jack Brown mask is very famous. This mask was certainly made famous years after it was introduced in the early 40s on the television series Sea Hunt with Lloyd Bridges starring as Mike Nelson as the lead character of the television show. At the opening sequence of that program, you see Mike Nelson putting on the triangulated Jack Brown mask in that opening sequence of the film. So anyway, that became very, very popular, but this was, again, another shallow water mask. It was to be used similar to the Victor Berg mask, and this could be used with a couple different configurations. It was a next step up from the manufactured mask for the Jack Brown rebreathers that were being used for the military combat units. And this was a system that could be utilized with that, or it could be supplied from the surface with an umbilical, or again with a hose connected to a storage bottle. So pretty interesting mask. Next one in line is a Captain Max W. Taylor mask. This is ultra rare. I've actually never seen another one. It's designed with a couple of pliable bladders that you can exhale air into and fill them. And at depth, you can either get an additional breath, or, as was suspected, that this could possibly have been designed as a bailout mask for submarine crews. And if that was the case, you could lock out of a submarine if it was sunk at, maybe 150 or 200 feet of water, blow some air into these bladders to make your exit from the sub and skyrocket to the surface. And since you were only pressurized at ambient pressure for just a couple of minutes, you didn't really run the risk of decompression sickness. So you would have to take your chances, but you could get a couple of breaths on the way as you started to make your ascent. The air in those bladders would expand and give you a couple of breaths on your way to the surface. And it was very much like a Momsen lung system, and that's probably what it was designed for, although no Navy record of it ever being adopted. So this is a great mask, fun to see. This is another version of the Jack Brown mask, except that it's incorporated with its own second stage regulator. And so versus having a system of valves and adjustments like the earliest version did, this later version allowed the diver to just have a supply either from a storage bottle or from the surface, and you just had a ambient pressure demand regulator. So that was a nice system. It's an evolution up. This is kind of a fun mask. This is the Riviera single piece mask. The entire strap and frame of the mask, everything is molded out of one piece of plastic or rubber with a plastic lens in. And this was made by a company called Riviera. And it's interesting because they were really more recognized for almost like toy quality or swimming pool quality products, although in the early days, back in the 50s, they actually carved out a substantial portion of the scuba or freediving equipment market. So they produced fins and masks and snorkels and things like that. And this is just an example of that. It's nothing particularly special other than it came from that period of time, and that it represents a part of the industry that was unusual in the respect that they produced a lot of product and sold it to lots of kids and things like that. So they had carved out a significant piece of the business for themselves in the early days. So it's kind of neat. This next mask is actually famous. This is the famous Voight B4 model. It's B-4, and this mask was used in many, many episodes of the Lloyd Bridges TV series Sea Hunt. And so this mask is famous, and there's a great example of it, and there's actually a photograph right here of Lloyd Bridges wearing the B4 mask there with his double hose setup. Voight Manufacturing supplied nearly all of the equipment for the Sea Hunt series. They worked out a contract with them and supplied most of the equipment, and so this is an example of that. So it's pretty amazing. Our next mask is a Nuvo Vita mask. It's from Italy, but what's really unique about this is several things. Number one, it's got the dual lens, so it's just an interesting looking mask. It has one of the first nasal pinches to allow the wearer to be able to equalize using the mask. All these other types of masks were a little bit different. You would have to take the skirt of the mask and shove it up against your nostrils to either equalize, or you could slide your fingers completely underneath the skirt, slide your mask a little bit, pinch your nose to equalize. But these were a little bit more challenging, and this is the reason that the nasal pinch actually even came into play. This is from the 1950s, so it's one of the earliest versions of the nasal pinch type mask. The other interesting thing is that it's a Decor manufactured mask, and Decor was out of the United States in Illinois, and from Sam Davison's Decor system, or his company. But what's fascinating about this mask is it was made in Italy, and it says right on the frame, made in Italy. That's unusual because it's hard to know how many manufacturers around the world may have contracted to make certain products. So it's just an unusual piece that it wasn't a US-made piece of equipment, but it was also made for a US company. So very